Um, Time has become a bit of a demon this afternoon, and I have, rather than handing things over to you, which we'll do a little later, hopefully, I'm really obliged now, because he's been waiting long, and he's our host, to introduce Andy Pearce, who's the creative director of all external exhibitions here at Urbis. There we are. Andy, there you go.
Phew. Crikey, can't tell you how scary this is. It's the first time I've ever seen my name on that screen, despite being responsible for the sort of design and installation of it, because I don't normally kind of do talks. I definitely don't do theories and concepts of design. So when I got asked to do the final talk in this presentation today, that's very, very frightening indeed. I was actually working in Manchester, though, in 1996. And was in the city when the bomb went off. And there is a football connection. Manchester was a target because the city was at that time hosting Euro 96, and the world's press were already here. And remarkably, and especially if you think about what happened this weekend, the following day, despite all that devastation, Germany played Russia at Old Trafford and 50,000 people attended. And I was one of them. The result, because I know you want to know, we're in the National Football Museum. Germany won 3-0, Klinsmann scored twice. They went on to win the tournament. They knocked out England in the semi-finals on penalties, of course. But what was I going to talk about? Well, I'm kind of a social historian of ordinary people. I can only really talk about kind of what I know and my own sort of experiences of around 30 years of change in the city, in the region, and in particular, sort of the change in heritage buildings and spaces I've worked on, and the impact of this on people's sense of identity and place. I came to Manchester about 30 years ago. What was it like? I've still got the guidebook to Manchester in 1984, and there are more pages on the imminent nuclear destruction of the city than there are on places to eat and drink or art galleries and museums to visit. We were all going to die. The only escape was to get yourself right out on the peripheries of the city region. So, interesting place to come to. My first job, kind of quite ironically, I think, considering what we're talking about today, was actually at the College of Building. It's about where what we know as Spinningfields is today. And my job, let me just put my prop down. My job was kind of teaching sort of youth trainee, brickies and plasterers about something that I now can't quite remember. It wasn't very rewarding. I was there to get off the dole, and so were they. My second job, a bit more interesting, was at Saddleworth Museum. I'm now not really sure whether I went there because of that warning about imminent nuclear attack, because that's getting quite out on the borders of the city. It was an interesting place to work. There were only 2 members of staff. There was me, and there was an eccentric curator who spent most of his time doing yoga, dressed only in his pants. But what it did allow me to do was kind of do everything to do with the museum, from sort of cataloguing the collections to cleaning the toilets. And a lot of time spent with the volunteers who'd actually kind of restored this former woolen mill, and it was a real labour of love to them. And I soon came to realise that what this museum was about and its restoration, and the white rose symbol should have given me a clue. For them, it was all about asserting an identity they felt had been taken away from them when Saddleworth was transferred out of Yorkshire into Greater Manchester in the 70s. It was an eye-opener for me on how powerful the built environment and material heritage was and is in defining people's identity and sense of place. The museum's about to go a long-awaited, another HLF-funded big restoration, and you can bet your bottom dollar that sense of its separateness and identity will be what will be in that museum. My second job was at the then new Greater Manchester Museum of Science and Industry, and the words Greater Manchester are very important here. Where at Saddleworth, the whole idea of the museum seemed to be about emphasising the differences. The Greater Manchester Museum of Science and Industry was about bringing places together. It was established by Greater Manchester County Council on the Liverpool Road Station complex of buildings. And I think they saw something that all 10 constituent boroughs of Greater Manchester could aspire to, or even just agree on. A chance to celebrate, commemorate and promote the region's shared identity via its unique role as the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. And that was definitely what it felt like when you were working there at the time. It was a privilege to be part of a team that was not only revealing some of that shared history for the first time, but also doing it in what was then an innovative and exciting way, and breathing life into former industrial buildings that had been considered eyesores for decades. What added to our sense of kind of doing something special at the time was that reuse of heritage buildings seemed to spread outside the Liverpool Road complex, and particularly into Castlefield, a place where when I first went there were rag and bone men's horses in stables in the arches. I moved on in 1994, joined the Pump House People's History Museum that was then quite new. The Pump House itself is a good example of the creative reuse of a former industrial building. The building began life in 1911 as an hydraulic pumping station, closing in the 70s. But it had another life before being converted into a museum. And we come back to the College of Building, which was next door. And the place where the brickies and plasterers in the pump house, the ones I'd taught a decade earlier, used to build and knock down a bungalow in the pump house every year to learn their trade. It would be a bit of an exaggeration to say that the Pump House Museum had anything like the influence that perhaps the Museum of Science and Industry had on Castlefield, on the Spinningfields area. Apart from that is adding a street name to Spinningfields, which was Left Bank. At that time, it certainly felt very disconnected from the city centre, although the museum made up for this by having an inclusive programme of events and exhibitions that connected it very strongly with the city's diverse communities. I left there in 2000 to lead the transformation of Rochdale's Victorian Informal Library to create a new integrated art gallery, museum, local studies, archive and visitor centre, Touchstones Rochdale. I got my own hard hat, I got a yellow vest, and my dad thought I'd got a proper job at last. But the building work was only half of it. By the start of the new millennium, the expectations for this type of project was not just to create a popular functional museum or gallery, but to launch urban regeneration, promote community cohesion, create employment, inspire pride of place, etc., probably stopping only short, I think, of raising the dead. A tall order in a borough as poor as Rochdale, and one where the unofficial aspirational comedy mission statement was the one that you see on the screen now. Did we fulfill expectations? Well, I think thanks to a process that shared the creation of Touchstones with the widest possible community, we might have done our bit for pride of place. The name Touchstones, by the way, was chosen by the public. It means both the two archaic heads that stand in the entrance, but also signifies that they felt this place would hold the community's own touchstones of art, creativity, culture and identity. The same process helped us contribute to community cohesion, I think. In fact, we won awards for it. In fact, we won a few awards for our building, our interpretation, and my absolute favourite, we won Tourist Information Centre of the Year in 2003 in Rochdale. Visit Rochdale 2003. But the bigger picture, regeneration, job renewal, I don't think so. The money ran out in Rochdale, as it always does, and I got a chance to return to lead another development of the People's History Museum in 2007. This time a project that would bring all the museum's collections, conservation studio and archives onto one site. But how the surrounding Spinningfield area had changed since I was last there. It felt like the city centre had now reached out to the museum. The College of Building had gone at last. But I did go and live for a while, it's kind of just on the right of this screen, in a flat on Left Bank, which I think actually occupied the same airspace as the classroom where I've been teaching the brickies and plasterers about 20 odd years before. It was a very different to something like the Museum of Science and Industry opening up in a derelict Castlefield. Here was the development of a museum deeply rooted in communities and working class culture in an area being described as the Knightsbridge of the North. I'll tell you a secret now. The new part of the museum could be curved, but it couldn't be round. Our imposing neighbour, the Civil Justice Centre, had already been nicknamed by some Mancunian wag the filing cabinet. And given the relative scale of the two buildings, we would inevitably have become the waste paper basket next to it. But I love the fact that a museum documenting the historic struggles of the industrial working class, clad in rusty steel, is directly across the road from the establishment, sitting behind the largest plate glass wall in Europe. The museum opened in 2010 and kind of held its own amongst its neighbours, even winning some awards for its design. But my favourite accolade is that it didn't win Museum of the Year. Let's face it, a museum that holds both the Labour and Communist Party archives is not going to win the year Michael Portillo is chair of the judging panel. It did, however, win the vote for People's Choice Museum of the Year, which for an organisation whose mission is to tell the story of the struggle for democracy, I think is about right. Finally, I got to work on bringing the National Football Museum into this amazing building, and that's been both a privilege and a challenge. A completely glass building and a collection of historic items which are sensitive to light, that's never going to be an easy match. But if you imagine that you are currently at pitch level and look up behind me at the tiers of the stand or a stadium, you could be forgiven for thinking that telling the story of our national game was exactly what Urbis was designed for. And in terms of football heritage, place and identity, where else could it be told but Manchester? As I said at the start, I'm not great on theories, so I'm not going to draw any sort of fantastic conclusions from my own personal experience of the region's development, except that it's never been dull to be part of it. I do have one observation, though, on the palm trees. Just a stone's throw from Exchange Square was one of the biggest soap works in Britain, and masses of palm oil were imported to that soap works. So I would have immediately got that what those palm trees are about was Manchester's imperial connections and its colonies importing the palm oil. So I would have got that one. But other than that, I've only really got two other conclusions. I bet those brickies and plasterers that I was training in the 80s have done pretty well in Manchester in the last few years. And I'm pretty sure that all the city guides in 2016 are going to have a lot more pages on where to eat and drink and the museums and galleries to visit than they are on what's going to happen after a nuclear attack. So I really hope you've enjoyed your day at National Football Museum. It's been absolutely brilliant and illuminating for me, and thank you so much for listening. Cheers.
See, it's all coming together in one big circle. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Andy.